Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the primary arms Cyclops Microprism with the Gen 2 ACSS reticle. But before we get into the video, I actually do need to thank the sponsor of the video, and that is actually Optic's Planet. They carry a wide variety of just about anything you could ever want on back order. So go ahead and text that number. It does help out the channel quite a bit, and on top of that will give us access to review some pretty cool stuff coming up. Now, full disclosure on the primary arms 1X Microprism is that I am a dealer for primary arms optics. I have done reviews on other primary arms optics in the past, most of them fairly favorably. I have had some communication with Dimitri at Primary Arms. He basically had an angry phone call with me after I reviewed their 1:6 with the ACSS Aurora reticle. I said some stuff in the video that he didn't quite agree with. If you've never met or interacted with Dimitri, he's a fairly driven fellow, if you will. He makes very, very good stuff, and he is very good at what he does, and he is very, very specific in the wording and how he designs all of his stuff. So he also commented on the last video that I did on this optic for gun deals, which, by the way, I make 10 videos a month for them as a paid contributor, so go ahead and check out gun.deals as well. But I am a dealer for primary arms optics, and several months ago I purchased this with my own money, though again at a wholesale reduced cost. Now, after that, I had one of their marketing fellows reach out to me and see if I wanted to review some of their products for free. So they're actually also going to be sending out the GLX 2.5 to 10 with the ACSS Griffin mil-dot reticle and their new PLX scope mount. I did pay my own money for this optic, which was of course at a reduced wholesale cost because I am a dealer for primary arms, and they will be sending me out new product to review for free. So that is the entire relationship there. It has been from buying products at full price to wholesale price, and now they are actually sending me stuff for free. However, that will of course not stop me from pointing out flaws or gripes that I have with this specific optic. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into some of the specifics on the Cyclops Gen 2. So first off, as you can tell, this is a 1X Microprism. It is the smallest, the lightest, the most compact 1X prism on the market. There's only a few of them out there right now, but in terms of size and weight, this takes the cake in terms of being the smallest and the lightest. Depending on your mount configuration height and the combo of straight risers and cantilever risers that you use, that they do include, which we will get into in a minute, the base weight is only around 7 ounces, which is only slightly more than your standard T1 or T2 style of optics, which again for a microprism is no small feat. Now, the optic body, riser, and mount, as far as I could tell, are all made out of 6061 aluminum, which is a very good, very economical choice. It's still very strong, especially in a very compact package like this. The mounting hardware itself is steel. You have 2 steel crossbolts on a very large clamping ball block, which I like quite a bit, and they actually thread into steel nut inserts on the other side, so you have steel on steel action instead of steel on aluminum, which I do not prefer. On the optic body itself, we do have exposed windage and elevation turrets, though they are very nicely protected by large aluminum extrusions. A minor point of controversy on the turrets themselves is that the adjustments are in 1 MOA graduations instead of half MOA graduations like you will find on a lot of other optics, smaller optics even in this price category. For me personally, that is a very small gripe, as that means your maximum zero error will be half MOA, which is very, very small. And again, that's your maximum zero error. So basically whatever you zero it at with your ammunition, whether it's 50 or 100 yards, the maximum potential error in that zero, the most refined you can get that zero, is a maximum of half MOA off, though realistically it'll be somewhere like a quarter MOA off. And now remember, a half MOA, if you miss your target by a half MOA, more likely it's the fact that you did not get your wind call right, you did not get your hold correctly, something in there rather than the actual zero error. So while that is a very minor gripe, and we would of course like to see half MOA adjustments for the intended use case of the optic, it's really not that big of a deal, though it is worth noting. A couple more things on the optic body itself. We do of course have a illumination dial and battery tray on the left hand side. The battery in question is a CR2032, which is very common. Now we have 13 different settings on the brightness itself. We have 3 night vision settings, low, medium, and flood. And then we also, of course, have our 10 daylight settings. Now on maximum daylight brightness of 13 or 12, it looks very, very good outside in full-on daylight bright conditions, full direct sunlight. It looks very good. If you like illuminated reticles, this is going to make you very happy. If you don't really care for it and you just like the black chevron in the center, it's also going to work just fine. So I think for this optic, they did a good job of pleasing both camps. It's a good option to have if you want it, and if you don't want it, just simply turn it off. Now, getting into the battery life itself on the Cyclops Gen 2 reticle, now I have the green version, and I believe the red version is slightly different in terms of its overall battery life. On the green version, I believe it's rated at 20,000 hours at a medium brightness setting, so somewhere in the 6, 7, 8 range, I would imagine. However, that is comboed with Primary Arm's Auto Live technology or Auto Live technology. Basically, the reticle will automatically turn off and automatically turn on when it senses motion. Now, what that does is it helps to extend your battery life dramatically. Now, in the literature, they say that it combos with their battery life, so I'm not sure if it's 20,000 hours of constant on or 20,000 hours of on and off with their Auto Live technology. Personally, I've had this for several months and been using it quite a bit. I've used it on basically every gun that I own, and I have not had a battery die yet. However, if I was going to use this, for longer periods of time, say several years, I would probably swap out the battery every year or every other year at the latest and call it good. So for something that is not a red dot, I would say that the battery life is exceptional. Now on the rear of the optic, we have our diopter. Now the diopter in general on like LPVOs is used to adjust the reticle to your eye. Dimitri actually said that he uses the diopter to make the 1X look as good as possible, at his desired eye relief section. But that's going to vary from person to person and eyes to eyes. So basically figure out what works best for you and then go from there. Now, when we talk about mounting options, here is something that Primary Arms did very well. In the box, they include the straight section, cantilever section, the base mount, of course, as well, which gives you a total of 8 different heights, anything from a 1.1 all the way up to a 2.075. So basically, whatever gun you want to put this on, if you want to put this on an AK and you want to have a very, very low mount, you can absolutely do that with just the included base mount. As you see it here in this configuration, I have it at a 1.535, so just basically a standard co-witness height, if you will. And of course, you can make it very, very tall if you wanted to use it on a different gun, or you just like the more upright head position, or if you're using it with night vision. This does have night vision settings. I don't have night visions to test them with, so I cannot speak as to whether or not those are actually good or how well the optic performs under night vision. And again, all of those different mounting options are included in the box with all the appropriate hardware and Loctite, so you get everything that you need right out of the box. Now, I believe they also sell now a taller straight riser, so you don't need to get a taller height, you don't need to do a straight riser plus a crazy long cantilever mount, which can look a little bit ridiculous. So I believe they do sell just a longer straight riser now separately for I think it's like 20 bucks or something like that, if you wanted a taller, straighter mount. Now let's go ahead and talk about the eye relief, eye box, and of course the glass quality. Now the eye relief on their website, the optimal position, I believe they claim is 3.6 inches for the best field of view. Because again, while this might perform somewhat like a red dot, because this is a lot of curved glass in front of your eye, the distance away from your eye is actually going to change the perceived magnification, as well as adjusting the diopter can change the perceived magnification. So for instance, if I put this all the way to the back and was using it, it would change the magnification for my eyes to something like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, somewhere in that range. And if I had it way forward on the gun, it would actually make it something like 0.8, 0.9, which is why you'll see most people that I've seen kind of running the Prism in the middle of their receiver, because if you have it too far forward, you have a little bit of a negative magnification effect, and if you have it too far back, you get a plus magnification effect. Again, it's going to depend on your stock, your neck, your body dynamics, all that sort of fun stuff. So again, set it up in the proper position. Now, at that 3.6 inches of eye relief, they say you also have a very extended range, honestly down to like 1 inch. out to say, 15 inches of usable eye relief, which is very nice. Now that also combos into having a very good eye box. So the eye box is basically, if you can get your eye behind the optic in any way, you're going to be able to see that reticle. So while no, it's not quite as forgiving as a red dot, or especially like a really, really big windowed red dot, it is still very good and impressive for its size. Now, when we talk about glass quality, this is an area where, while it does fine, it's nothing special. And it's going to be just like any of your other overseas made optics. I would say it's bright enough, it's crisp enough, it looks just fine, but it's nothing special whatsoever. It's not the brightest, it's not the crispest. There might be a tiny bit of distortion around the edges, at least that's what I perceive when I'm looking through it. So while it's not bad by any means, it's just kind of par for the territory, which is just fine. So all of that is well and good. Now let's go ahead and get into the reticle, which is going to be a bit of a double-edged sword. Now this is the Cyclops Gen 2 reticle. The Gen 1 reticle, from what I understand, was a little bit smaller and a little bit harder to see. So they wanted to make that a little bigger, a little bit easier to pick up, a little faster, that sort of thing. Because again, we are talking about a 1x optic, in theory going to be used in closer range engagements, let's say. Now at the center of the Cyclops Gen 2 reticle, we have our nearly ubiquitous ACSS chevron, which I am a fan of chevron aiming points in certain circumstances. The main thing that I like about them is that they have a very fine tip, a point of infinite precision for aiming, which when I want to put around exactly where I want it to go in relation to the zero, of course, I really like having that very perfectly fine, very fine aiming point, if you will, so I can refine it as much as possible and put that round exactly where I want it. Then on the outside of that chevron, we of course have our horseshoe section. Now the horseshoe does a couple things. Of course, up close, say at 5, 10, 15 yards, depending on your target size, you can use that as a very fast aiming solution. Basically just put the horseshoe on the target, pull the trigger, and you're going to get a good impact, again, depending on your target size. Now it also helps to draw our eye to the center of the optic and therefore pick it up just a little bit faster. If you're familiar with like EOTech, Donative Deaths, or any other reticles that use a large circular section on the outside of their finer aiming point, you're going to be a fan and very familiar with this. Then in the bottom of the glass, we have our auto ranging solution. So basically you can bracket targets either horizontally or vertically. So if you're doing it vertically, basically place the bottom section at their feet, and you should be able to tell whether an average sized human is at 200, 300, or 400 yards. And you can also do the same thing with the average human shoulder width. Again, giving you a rough estimation of whether they're at 200, 300, or 400 yards. Now, personally, the double-edged sword for me in the reticle design actually has to do with the center chevron reticle. Now, the chevron does a lot of things really well, like we've already discussed. If you want a very fine point of aim and to put that round exactly where you want it in relation to your zero, of course, it does a very good job of that. On top of that, it also has BDC kind of built into the center chevron as well. So if you're zeroing it at 50, 200, or 100 yards with a 16-inch 5.56, they give you kind of a breakdown of where you should be aiming on man-sized targets out to 300, 400, and I believe even 500 yards in some circumstances using the center chevron. Now, when I complained about this a little bit, keep in mind that this was designed for full-size targets. But when we're talking about smaller targets or reduced probability targets, at sort of a mid-range distance, say somewhere between 200 and 300 yards or 200 and 350 yards, that center chevron can kind of start to work against you. And what I mean by that is the reticle up close, is again inside of 100 yards, is a very good blend of speed and accuracy. But when you're in that sort of mid-range distance, it can actually obscure smaller targets basically completely. So say you're shooting at like an 8-inch steel at 250 yards. It can be very difficult to tell where that steel is in relation to your reticle, because again, the reticle is covering most of it up, if not all of it up, again, depending on the target size and the actual distance. So there's kind of an area where it's almost more imprecise than if you just had a 2 MOA dot, because even an 8-inch gong at 300 yards, a 2 MOA dot would not fully cover that up. and so you could definitely tell where that reticle was in relation to the steel target, or again, whatever small target that you're shooting at. So while I do think the reticle does a very good job inside of 100 yards, I don't have any complaints about that, and it would certainly do very well at extended distances on full-size targets, because on full-size targets, you're not really going to be obscuring the whole thing, and you're definitely going to have enough vertical variation in those targets to be able to see exactly where you're putting the reticle. But where it kind of falls off a little bit is in those mid-range distances at reduced size targets, because the reticle, while it is very fine and precise, just by virtue of it being a larger chevron, it will cover up a much larger section at those extended distances. Therefore, if you're shooting at a smaller target, it'll be harder to see where the reticle actually is in relation to that target. Now, even with that, I would still say that the primary arm Cyclops is better than like 95% of red dots on the market in terms of precision at mid-range, low probability targets, just because most 2 MOA dots are not actually 2 MOA, and they tend to bloom out if they're not at the exact right illumination level. And they also, if you look at certain dots, they can be like oblong and not perfectly concentric. Whereas the etched reticle on the Prism optic is, well, an etched reticle on a Prism optic, and it's very crisp and very precise. Now, that being said, I've had this optic for a long time. I've used it on a lot of different guns. At this point, I probably have 2,000 to 3,000 rounds on this specific optic on, say, 10 or 12 different guns. Any of you guys have seen it for quite some time here on the channel, and it's performed very well. 95% of the time, I've been shooting it at 100 yards and in, and very occasionally taking it out to 200 or 300 yards on larger targets without issue. I've also used this in a 2-gun competition, and as long as my skills were up to the task, it performed just fine. Now we're gonna go ahead and talk about the double drop test, which is what I do on basically every optic that I test. But before we get into that, we do wanna talk about the mount and torque setup. So we actually have 3 steel cross bolts going up through the base mount, through the riser, and then into the body of the optic itself. I believe I had those torqued to 30 inch-pounds each, which I believe is an appropriate amount of torque for steel into aluminum. And then on the steel into steel cross bolts, I had those torqued all the way up to 65 inch-pounds, which is more than what they recommend, but on this mount, it actually worked just fine. On top of that, on the base mount itself, we also have basically 2 recoil lugs on the bottom that are kind of like cut out a little bit, so it's almost like 2 halves of a recoil lug that kind of butt up against the upper receiver, therefore increasing your contact surface and your repeatability in return to zero if you were taking this on and off, theoretically, as long as you were putting it back to the exact same spot on your rail. Now, with all of that out of the way, we fire a 5-round control group. This was done with the Barrel Creek Arsenal 7.62x39. So we fire a 5-round control group at 50 yards, and we had a pretty decent group of around 1 inch, 1¼ inches at 50 yards. Then we do our double drop test, which is 1 on the top of the optic, 1 on the side of the optic from shoulder height onto dirt and rocks, just the area where I happen to be shooting. Get cushioned by anything. All right. And then we go ahead and shoot another 5-round group. Now, one thing that you'll notice is the second 5-round group was incredibly tight. It was basically all 5 rounds touching. And even though this is a very cheap Barrel Creek Arsenal 7.62x39, it uses an insanely heavy barrel profile. And I was using some of that Red Army standard that I've shot 1 MOA with another Barrel Creek Arsenal heavy barrel. So this shoots incredibly accurate with the right loading. Now, the group kind of moved up just a tiny bit after the double drop test. However, the first round of the second group was in the same exact spot as the last round of the first group, and the margin of error, if there was any variation in the group location, could have also been, it was within the margin of error of the parallax from getting off the optic, getting back onto it. If my head was in a slightly different position, if the barrel was slightly hotter, for all intents and purposes, there was no appreciable shift in zero. And in all my time with the primary arm Cyclops, I've never had a performance-related issue. I've never had a loss of zero on any of the many guns that I've tested. I've never had the mount come loose, anything like that. And it performed perfectly fine during the drop test as well, with very light marring on the body. There's really nothing about the optic design, the mounts, or the risers that gives me pause as to their long-term durability. So if you're looking for something that has an etched reticle and is theoretically something that will last forever, because of course it does not rely on batteries, then it is another feather in the Cyclops' cap. Now, something that I do want to talk about the Cyclops is its actual 1x performance, especially when we compare it against its main competition, which is probably just going to be your standard budget red dot. Now, I've heard some other people say that this is the ultimate 1x optic, this is the best, close quarters optic, the ultimate, that sort of thing being used. And when we talk about its performance, its 1x performance versus a red dot, it's really going to fall flat. The reason for me is that this is still a prism optic. This is not a true 1x. You're seeing through a series of curved glass, you're not seeing what's actually there. And while it might be a very good 1x recreation, it is not perfect. And so when we're talking about a red dot, any decent red dot is going to have a near perfect 1x, and I mean legitimately a near perfect 1x, as little distortion, as little warping as possible. And there's going to be a noticeable difference between a red dot and a microprism. Even though I would say this is still very good, the 1x performance does still lag behind a little bit. But the reason for me is that when I bring this up, the image is in the glass is slightly different than what I'm seeing with my eyes. When I'm using a red dot, there's virtually no difference whatsoever. And so it's a little bit faster, a little bit more natural for most people, I would imagine. Now, that could be a training thing as well. I have not put as much time on microprism optics as I have on red dots. However, I think it's fairly indisputable that red dots are going to have a more natural, more true image than something like a 1x prism. Because again, this is a recreation of a 1x image versus a decent red dot, which is going to have the least amount of distortion, warping, magnification possible. So while I don't think that the PA Cyclops can quite compete with red dots in terms of true 1x performance, I do think that the trade-off there is that you get a very versatile optic that is not reliant upon batteries, and it gives you a very close, very good recreation of 1x. On top of that, with the ACSS reticle, you do get auto-ranging features as well. You get the chevron, which, again, depending on your use case, is going to be either very good or slightly less good than that, so it's still a very good option. You get a very fast, a very quick reticle, again, with all of those extra features built into it that also has, of course, illumination as well, though again, it's not necessary on the optic, but it is there and it is quite good. So while it does not compete with red dots in terms of true 1x performance, it definitely makes up for that for most people in terms of versatility. So now if you're looking for the best 1x option, you're going to be looking at a red dot. But for some people who cannot use red dots, people with an astigmatism or other issue that precludes them from using red dots, if you're concerned with size and weight, then the PA Cyclops with the Gen 2 reticle is going to be the best option on the market. There's really not a lot of other 1x prisms on the market. I believe you have the Swamp Fox Blade, which I have reviewed previously, but it's probably 2.5 times the size and weight, which again, for some people, if you're going with something that big, you might as well just get an LPVO. And it basically does all of the things that this does, though again, in a much larger, much heavier package. So again, if you can't use a red dot due to an astigmatism or some other issue, or you just want something that does not require illumination, something that will truly last forever, as long as it, of course, does not get destroyed, then the primary arms Cyclops is going to be basically the only option on the market for them, and it is going to be a very, very good option. So at the end of the day, if you're looking for the best, truest 1x performance, then you're probably still going to be stuck with a red dot or a holographic style of optic. But if you're looking for something more versatile, or again, you're somebody who cannot use red dots or holographic style optics, then the primary arm Cyclops Gen 2 is probably the best possible optic that you can get on the market. Again, especially if you're concerned with size and weight, because this is a very small, very true micro prism optic. It is very compact, very lightweight, and again, only around 7 ounces or so. And it's not all that expensive. You know, it's under what most similarly priced and featured LPVOs would be. I believe the primary arms 1 to 6 starts at around $300 or so, but that's of course much bigger, much heavier, and a totally different optic. So for a small set of the population, this is probably the best optic on the market, and for most of the population, it's a very good option if you have a specific use case for it. But with all of that out of the way, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think of the primary arm Cyclops in the comments down below. And again, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.
Boom.